Welcome to a series of interviews with the advisory board and keynote speakers of the Shelley Conference 2022. The links to our social media accounts and website where you can find information on the conference, related events, and recordings of past events are in the description below this video. Today, I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Madeleine Callaghan, who is a senior lecturer in romantic literature at the University of Sheffield. She has published a plethora of articles and chapters on Shelley, as well as her monograph, Shelley's Living Artistry, Letters, Poems, Plays, published in 2018, The Poet Hero in the Works of Byron and Shelley, published in 2019, and a forthcoming Eternity in British Romantic Poetry. She worked with Michael O'Neill and Anthony Howe in the Oxford Handbook of Percy Bysshe Shelley in 2013, co-edited the Romantic Poetry Handbook with Michael O'Neill in 2017, and most recently, she has co-edited with Anthony Howe Romanticism and the Letter, published in 2020. In your book, Shelley's Living Artistry, you pay a lot of attention to Shelley's letters to Elizabeth Hitchener, who Shelley describes in one letter as the sister of his soul. How do you think that this early relationship with Hitchener informed Shelley's idea of sisterhood and sister spirits in his later poetry, Leon Sithner, Prometheus of Mound, etc.?
Hi, thanks Anna for such a kind introduction. I think the letters to Elizabeth Hitchener are some of Shelley's most incredible letters, and I'm always stunned in a sense that we're able to look at these kind of intimate documents on how Shelley interacts at this point with another and female interlocutor. So the sister question I think is interesting, given that Shelley, of course, had sisters and was very aware and attuned to how those relationships might work. He'd actually collaborated earlier in his life with that original poetry by Victor and Kazir with his sister Elizabeth. So we know that Shelley was fascinated by and deeply interested, I suppose, in what sisterhood might be for a male, I suppose. Leon and Sithner interest me because Carlos Baker's got that great line that Sithner's the apple of Shelley's revolutionary eye. And I wonder if dealing with Hitchener in the way Shelley does, he realizes how intensely intelligent but different from Shelley she is. And also that even as he's trying to convert her into thinking in particular ways, that she has her own ways of communicating with and altering the way he sees the world. I wonder with Leon and Sithner whether that relationship, combined with his new relationship with Mary Shelley, is about kind of the power of female speech and writing and thought in some sense, where we don't look at Leon in some way, we look at Sithner. She becomes the object of our fascination, a kind of Dido who doesn't need to die till the end. So I think that matters a lot. And with Prometheus Unbound, I guess when we're looking at these three sister spirits that we get, what we see is, I suppose, the significance and action importance. These aren't just women of feeling, these are women of action. They actually do something in the text, something Prometheus cannot do. So in a way, what surprised me when I was moving through this was realizing how very seriously Shelley takes women and how seriously he understands the revolutionary capacity of women, not just in terms of writing polite letters, but in terms of actually doing the heavy work when it comes down to it. So I think there's something really interesting there. And I think we could also, of course, link it to Byron, who's fascinated by sisterhood in a whole other way that perhaps isn't suitable for the under 12s. So we can play with ideas, I suppose, in terms of sisterhood, but I wonder if it's also likeness and unlikeness, Shelley being so drawn to a simile where something is like, but never quite.
That's great, thank you. So, do you believe that in Shelley's letters, he paints a picture of Shelley the poet or Shelley the man, and how does it reflect in his posthumous reputation?
It's such an interesting one when we think about how Shelley deals with the idea of the poet and the idea of the man. I mean, we love to quote, don't we? And I'm a total animal for doing it, where I'm always quoting, the poet and the man are two different natures. Though they exist together, they may be unconscious of each other and incapable of deciding upon each other's powers and effects by any reflex act. Well, that's gorgeous. And to some extent, fair that we don't get to conflate the man and the poet in any simple way. But I come back to Yeats, really, and Prynne. Yeats said that, no, the poet is not the man sitting down for breakfast, but there is always a phantasmagoria. And Yeats is so good as Shelleyan that he can see that use of the eye in such a fascinating manner, that it's never the poet getting to cut free the ties of self, but you're never just yourself. when you write. Art is always a transmutation, a kind of alchemy, but I don't think they're as separate as perhaps we wouldn't like, but they're certainly not tied together in any simple way. So when I read those letters, I suppose we're all at the mercy of those 26 letters of the English alphabet, aren't we, in this way, where we do our absolute best to kind of put down who we are, what we want, how we feel, but we'll always fall short. Language is another way, isn't it, of configuring ourselves. And poetry is even more dangerous and devious. Language on speed in some sense. So we're always left with a problematic connection that we can't define. I think why Shelley matters so much, perhaps to me, I'm sure to many others, is that I is so wonderfully I, but not I. You know, what is it, that Astrophil and Seller, I am not I, pity the tale of me. We're demanded to think.
Thank you. And are there any examples of Shelley's personality or sense of humor in his letters that may not be necessarily relevant to understand his work, but are good insight into his character that has stuck to you?
Do you know, there are so many moments that I find myself aware of Shelley's wit and Shelley's kind of power of personality. I mean, I love the remark he makes where he says, as to real flesh and blood, you know that I do not deal in those articles. You might as well go to a gin shop for a leg of mutton as expect anything human or earthly from me. Well, no, that's not true, and demonstrably untrue. Shelley is constantly in contact with all that is human, all that is earthly in his work. But that, where he plays upon what his friends think of him as this kind of aerial. Remember Charles Claremont talking about him as some being from another world, having barely met Shelley, if ever. He knows what people think and he plays with it. So I think there's something not quite self-lacerating, but incredibly self-aware. So the kind of wit and the wordplay, 2 minutes with Peter Bell III, not so much Leon and Sithna, to be fair, Witch of Atlas, the letters, it makes you understand a far more interesting and rounded thinker than sometimes we credit Shelley as. Triumph of Life as well, that sardonic ability he's got where he can write characters in this. He can soar as well as sink. So wit, I think, is everywhere. He's no po-faced moralist, Shelley. He can do and is far better than that. And it's always funny watching my students suddenly been stunned that Shelley said something funny. Shelley said something witty. And then they suddenly go, oh, of course he did. He does this everywhere. And I think sometimes we critics need to remind ourselves of that Shelley is not a caricature. He's capable of so many different modes and levels that perhaps that's the greatest joy of reading him, how much you have to bring to it.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Actually, my favorite aspect of Shelley's wit is in A Defense of Poetry, when he's describing the posthumous reputation of the great poets. And he says, oh yeah, of course, we don't talk about the bad things. We wouldn't say that Homer was a drunkard, blah, blah. But he starts with like the worst and ends with a dig on Soldi about the poet laureate, which again is like something that goes a bit unexpected with Shelley, but it's always fun.
Exactly. We did a little bit of knockabout fun. And so Wordsworth is my favourite elegy to a person who is alive. So, you know, Shelley knew his way around all of the different types of humour and certainly engaged in them.
So in your monograph, Eternity in British Romantic Poetry, you explore the relationship between the mortal and the eternal. A Defense of Poetry, Shelley says the posteriority has done ample justice to the great names now referred to, Homer, Spenser, Tasso, etc. Their errors have been weighted and found to have been dust in the balance. If their sins were as scarlet, they are now white as snow. They have been washed in the blood of the mediator redeemer, time. This is a very prophetic quote, as Shelley's flaws seem to have been pushed aside when the posthumous image of the angelic poet was created. Do you believe that as an individual, a poet is simultaneously a mortal man and the immortal poetical entity? For the romantic, is it being a poet that makes him immortal, or the idea of his being communicated through his work?
That's such an interesting question, such a problem, I suppose. I always think it's interesting when we start looking for flaws in our poets. Maybe it's because I'm aware I've been a highly flawed individual myself. I always wonder what that compulsion is. I wonder if maybe we love so much, right? And then we find the need to admit to ourselves that they're only as human as we are. But also when Shelley's transformed into an ineffectual angel, notice the kind of danger of that. Matthew Arnold being all kinds of dangerous with ineffectual. Seems to me that it's an attempt to declaw Shelley's politics and religion, to turn him into something that doesn't quite work, that is transcendent and beyond, means that we don't have to take the Mask of Anarchy too seriously, or Men of England. It's a fascinating way to make somebody irrelevant. So I suppose when I'm thinking about that question, I suppose one of the key things that a critic has to do is never suspend the judgment, but also to be aware of our own chronological snobbery as we decide what constitutes a sin or a flaw in our own day compared to theirs. So a poet is always mortal and always immortal by virtue of the fact that their work continues to be read. It's probably the best moment of the symposium, isn't it, when Diotima starts to explain that you can live forever through art. There is something that will save you from dust. Remember Byron's rage that rags like these will survive and he won't. There's something ever so dangerous about the power of poetry or writing to endure, because you're always trapped there. Remember what Auden said, you know, the words of the dead are modified in the guts of the living, how we twist and turn and misunderstand, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. So I think that art itself always straddles that line between immortal and mortal. It never gets to be freed from context and that this living hand of the poet who wrote, but it's never just that. And I think as we read, we have to think about maybe that difficulty as we move through this transhistorical. Are we trying to claim art as transhistorical purely? I should hope not. But at the same time, we can't make it just a case of what porridge John Keats had, can we? So it's always that mixture. And I think there is definitely something where these writers are drawn to posterity, maybe to make up for how they were treated in time. Keats and Shelley would be key figures who do so. But I do think this is a question that's dogged us all since the beginning of thinking about what art is and does. So because I have nothing incredibly innovative to tell you about that, what I would say is that we need to keep our attention to it. We mustn't censure or praise based upon merely our own understandings of what is good in 2022, but we also have to be alive to that kind of duality of time and eternity that I suppose runs through it all. Aspirations, I suppose, of immortality, not to sound too Wordsworthian, are so important to why some poets write, and to do them justice, we have to think through what that means and what it is.
Well, thank you for that. You gave me a lot to think, and I'm sure you gave a lot to think to anyone watching this video. And to finalize, a question that we like to ask in every interview we make is, what was your first experience reading Shelley, and which one is your favorite poem and why?
This is one of those ones where I want to say I was 4. Obviously, I was reciting Prometheus Unbound by heart. No, I wasn't. I didn't encounter really poetry at all until university. My parents weren't really readers, and I was a bit of a cuckoo, I suppose, for how much I really loved books. But my understanding of what literature was the novel, which I think would be quite standard for a lot of the students I meet. I wasn't versed in poetry, and frankly, it scared me. It seemed so different, all these rules, all this restriction. I had a lot of preconceptions about what poetry was and could mean. I remember thinking, not to be too Morrissey, but that it said nothing to me about my life. And then I stopped being so fundamentally obsessed with myself and realised, actually, this had so much to do with what it was to be human. And elitism was nothing more than things I hadn't experienced yet. So I started to read and engage. And then I was fortunate enough to have Michael O'Neill as a lecturer at the university where I studied. And he gave a fantastic lecture on Shelley. And I remember feeling electric afterwards because there was so much I disagreed with. Already, I was incredibly willing to challenge everything I heard. And at the same time, I remember thinking, I'd never heard anybody do that. I'd never heard anybody think like that. I didn't know that poetry could be so philosophically imbued. I didn't know that poetry could range from, I don't know, the condition of men in England in 1819, all the way up to what it means to feel and be at the worst moments of our lives. I didn't know you could do that in so few words. I didn't know that language could be an event itself, and yet it suddenly was. So I realised as I read more and more of Shelley that there was no end to experience for a reader that loved to read poetry. It was everywhere. All these different modes and means and thoughts and abilities and beliefs are all clashing all the time. And you've got a poet that can love Radcliffe and Lucretius at the same time as he can adore Plato and Plotinus. I didn't know you could do that. And so my love for Shelley came from just how much variation there could be, where something could be so distinctly Shelleyan and yet be so different from poem to poem. And then I suppose now the question, what I love the most. Oh God, ask me any day, any hour, and I'll tell you a different answer. I want to say something today, because it's raining and horrible, and I'm sulking because I'm having to do a lot of preparation and marking. I'll tell you the triumph of life, and I'll tell you about the figures on the bubble rising. But other days, I'll take mutability, so that I can think about how much Shelley plays with ideas. Epipsychidion, because I didn't know you could perform that kind of intensity in language and yet be self-undercutting, where it seems so personal, and yet you realise that he's playing upon Dante and so many others to get where he's going intellectually. I think that I'll never stop having different favourite Shelley poems. Even when I used to teach a module every year called Byron and Shelley, every year I'd end up changing the curriculum because of new loves and new things that I wanted people to experience. Also, students coming to me, one of them madly in love with Leon and Sithna, telling me this is the poem. And then others running away to tell me that Alastor is everything and they'd never seen the world like that. So I think that maybe for me and maybe for others, it's about those changes and those shifts, and Shelley allows me so much kind of wiggle room to choose endlessly between competingly beautiful ideas. So yeah, all and everything. I haven't met a Shelley poem I don't really like.
So thank you very much, Dr. Callaghan, for your insightful answers, and thank you everybody for watching this video. And please make sure to check our previous video, which is a recording of the Jane Poems Roundtable with Dr. Callaghan, Professor Kelvin Everest, Dr. Marie-Lise Roberts, and Professor William Keat.
Thank you, Anna.